I'll just dive right in so we can get going. Let's start, just with some background for those of you that are tuning in. I always have to give a little bit of information about where I'm from if they haven't heard of ARPA-E. ARPA-E is the Advanced Research Projects Agency for Energy. It is the Department of Energy's high risk, high reward, moonshot funding agency. We're a relatively new agency. We were, kind of authorized in 2007. We got our first money and actually began, operating, I guess, if you will, in 2009. So we're only about 12 years old at this point. And, we're modeled after DARPA, and we really try to pursue, like I said, high risk, high reward, moonshot types of programs. And we really want to, overcome kind of, major technological barriers that can be transformative and lead to, greater national security, leadership in science and technology, and the types of problems that we're trying to solve. The types of solutions we are trying to offer are precisely those that you would expect from the Department of Energy's Advanced Research Projects Agency. These are things like resilient energy infrastructure, affordable, sustainable energy, economic development, and then, of course, like global leadership in science and technology. The thing I think about, and the thing that motivates the programs that I'm working on, and is that, kind of the underpinning driver for the discussion I'm going to, kind of go through today about connecting, agriculture to carbon markets, is climate change mitigation. So let me start with this. This plot comes from a National Academy study in 2019 that looked at negative emissions technologies and reliable sequestration. What's important here is to look at the red line. The red line in the middle is the path that we need to follow to keep global temperatures below 2 degrees. So on the the x-axis here is time, the y-axis is net emissions in gigatons per year. So we actually need to drive down emissions. And the interesting thing here is that we need to go through zero. Our ability to stay on this path below 2 degrees through just emissions reductions alone, that passed us by in the 90s. We didn't do enough. And so therefore we have to build out the capacity to actually go to zero and then go through zero and build out the capacity to do significant carbon removal. And the blue shaded region below the zero line are the net negative emissions. And the important thing to note here is that the contribution of those negative emissions, their contribution to the net emissions is quite substantial even before the crossover point. This is to say, we need to begin thinking about the technologies and deploying the technologies that will service this very large negative emissions industry very soon. You can see that by about 2100, we need the capacity to remove nearly 20 gigatons of carbon per year. And to give you a sense of just how much 20 gigatons of carbon is that in order to add up, the number of material flows to get to 20 gigatons, you'd have to add up a number of different things to kind of get there. So all of the material flows that are transported in the U.S. trucking industry, or Amazon boxes and other things that you see being transported by semis in the United States. The total amount from those material flows are about 9.8 gigatons. To get to 20, you'd have to add on top of that all the material flows in U.S. pipelines, and then on top of that, global cement and global iron ore production. So we are recognizing that this path to keeping global temperatures below 2 degrees and going through zero and becoming a carbon negative economy is going to produce and yield and require one of the largest industries on the face of the earth to be created. And so the reason why the Department of Energy is interested in negative emissions technologies, the reason the Department of Energy is looking at agriculture as a way to do carbon removal, is because we want to ensure that we can service this very large negative emissions industry with technologies that are both low cost and energy efficient. And the reason they need to be low cost and energy efficient is, yeah, if they're going to be very, very big. But if we, have, in 2100, we're achieving 20 gigatons of carbon removal at $100 per ton. By comparison, the burden to, the global economy would be similar to spending 3 times what the United States spends on defense, 2 times what we spend on healthcare programs, or 2 times what we spend on Social Security. Now, I understand this is big, but actually I want to point out that there should be reason for optimism by these numbers. First, the challenge is global, and the costs of carbon removal will be distributed globally. Secondly, these are the numbers for 2100 at 20 gigatons of removal per year. So that cost burden is not immediate. And thus, the third thing is there is some time to deploy more inexpensive terrestrial-based carbon dioxide removal approaches in the near term as tech improvements drive down the cost for more scalable engineered strategies like direct air capture and direct ocean capture. So ultimately, the adjusted price for carbon dioxide removal should be less than $100 a ton by 2100. So this is just to give you a sense of scale, but it is important that we develop these technologies, begin to deploy them, and really push to drive down the cost of carbon removal to service this very big industry very soon. And as I was noting, there's a number of strategies. The first are biological. These strategies essentially leverage the natural carbon cycling capacity of the environmental systems to remove carbon. And you can develop and implement technologies to augment the natural carbon cycling capacities of these systems and to improve carbon storage in them. There are engineered solutions. These engineered solutions include things like direct ocean capture, direct air capture, strategies to functionally convert CO2 to stored compounds to keep it from getting back into the atmosphere, or strategies to increase the kinetics and the utility of weathering, known as enhanced weathering and mineralization. And there are hybrid approaches as well. And in hybrid approaches, you leverage the same natural carbon cycling capacity from environmental systems, but then you match that accumulated biomass or that removed carbon up with downstream engineered approaches to maintain the carbon out of the environmental systems. That can include strategies to build buildings with biomass, so that the structures around us serve as a storage mechanism for carbon, or things like bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, or biochar. All of these things are being studied. And one of the things to really keep in mind here is that 20 gigatons, because I showed you how big it is, no one of those technologies is actually going to be a silver bullet that will service that entire industry. In fact, our economy is diverse, and there are unique environments and local economies that will be best suited for accommodating individual types of technologies. And the development and deployment of all of these approaches into unique environments and economies in an efficient way will be necessary to service this very large industry. And the staging for which they will be rolled out will be critical in meeting the demand for negative emissions and the expectations of the cost of those negative emissions that are being sought by the entities that are purchasing them. Now, beyond climate change and carbon removal, I do want to point out that we have other challenges that we need to keep in mind as a context for why we're looking at land and agriculture. And that is, things like food security. We have a growing population. By 2050, we anticipate, approximately 10 billion people. And although our global growing affluence in and of itself is not a bad thing, it's actually a good thing. It is another factor that is increasing the demands and resources on a per capita basis, even as the number of people continues to grow. And finally, land. We don't have more land. An estimate of land use required to feed the global population in 2050 suggests that we would need the land mass of 20% greater than Brazil to do that. And we don't have another Brazil, and we don't have, another Brazil plus 20% either. And so what I'm highlighting here is that we're actually going to need to innovate quite substantially in order to achieve, the ability to feed everybody and also to address, climate change because of the land limitations that we have. This plot shows, if we were to scale the ag system to feed everybody with current technologies, and what it suggests is that by 2050, with our current technology, there would be a gap in overall calories produced, and there would be a deficiency for feeding everybody. So this is just to say we need innovation as well as improving aspects of our ag systems. And so really the drivers for innovation and the thing that I'm going to be talking a lot about carbon markets. Carbon markets are going to promote the innovation that is necessary to achieve the challenges that we face. And the real things that we need to address are GHG emissions reductions and land sparing, and they go hand in hand. Just as I was saying, we need to take global emissions down to zero and then go negative. We need to do the same with respect to land. So right now we're still taking natural lands and we're converting it to ag lands. We need to slow down the rate of conversion of natural lands to ag lands down to zero and get to a point through innovation where we can turn that back and begin taking ag lands and converting it back into natural lands. So in both of these cases, we need to, quote unquote, go negative. And so that's why it's extremely important that we figure out how to connect ag systems to markets in order to drive the innovations that are necessary in these spaces. And the reason I'm focused on agriculture is because right now, agriculture, is part of the problem. It makes up for 8 to 10% of U.S. emissions, but we actually think it can be part of the solution. We think that we can drive down the emissions that are associated with agriculture on a net basis down to zero and still have room for innovation to allow the ag sector to offer negative emissions capabilities that are sold as an additional part of the system. There's going to need to be a lot of innovations in a lot of different areas. I'm not going to go through all of the specific individual technologies that need to do this, but what I wanted to highlight by showing that there needs to be, biotech research and engineering research in all of these different areas is that robust connection of ag systems to carbon markets can drive innovation in all of these necessary areas. So I did mention the fact that between 8 and 10% of global emissions are associated with ag. That's kind of the baseline of where we are now. 8.4%. You can see it on the far left-hand side. We think there's been assessments to show that we can drive those emissions down with best practices down to about 3.8% of emissions. And implementing some new strategies and some of these frontier technologies that are being considered could drive emissions from the ag sector down to zero and in fact offer negative emissions, carbon removal and accumulation of carbon in soils of about of an additional 4% of U.S. emissions. And so there's a lot of opportunity there. And indeed, there is tremendous growth in this area of climate smart agriculture. There's lots of companies getting into this, and really the goal would be to estimate the net carbon benefits. When you can do that, you can incentivize avoided emissions in ways that you can't do without robust markets. Okay, so why are we here today? I want to talk about the bioeconomy and the ability for the ag sector to offer a source of renewable, sustainable carbon that can be used to provide us fuels, chemicals, products, materials that can be produced sustainably and can displace our need for fossil-based fuels. And the bioeconomy can be grown in tandem with sustainable food production so that there's not competition for these things. And we need to think about, technologies to do that. And really the bioeconomy is the way for us to move to a sustainable new carbon economy. Now, the thing that is going to finance, the sustainability improvements that we can for the products that come out of the bioeconomy are the ability to do net carbon accounting through life cycle assessments that extend all the way up and all the way down the bioeconomy supply chain, starting, with, forests and farms, moving through the biotech sector and into the products that are produced from the bioeconomy. And with this will come the opportunity to move beyond just lower carbon products that the bioeconomy offers, like fuels and chemicals and materials, but also lower carbon products as well as carbon farming, which can, kind of decouple the attributes of a lower carbon product from the carbon attributes and service directly negative emissions markets. So that's what I'm going to be talking about. Now, let's be honest, we live in a carbon-based economy. Our iPhone cases and our fuels, many necessary types of fuels, chemicals, materials are carbon-based. And our future economy won't so much be a low-carbon economy as much as it will need to be a renewable, new carbon economy. And so the way that we actually get there is this bioeconomy concept, where feedstock biomass is produced sustainably and renewably. Conversion technology is applied, whether it's thermochemical or biochemical or electrocatalytic, what have you. You can convert that biomass into fuels, chemicals, products, and materials. And if on the front end, so on the feedstock side, if we have better capacities to have real-time tools for farmers and to quantify the carbon benefits of individual practices and to pay farmers for adopting them, we can start this, supply chain with a carbon negative feedstock with additional, efficiency measures throughout the supply chain, we can ensure that the products themselves become carbon negative. So the U.S. Has the capacity to produce 1.4 billion dry tons of biomass. Today's ag system has a tremendous output, but the capacity is far greater, okay? There's new opportunities in forestry and ag residues and new energy crops. And the U.S. Department of Energy's billion-ton study from a couple of years ago really highlighted the opportunity space for a growing bioeconomy, including, billions of gallons of biofuels, billions of pounds of bio-based chemicals and products, lots of jobs. One of the things about the renewable bioeconomy is it creates more jobs on a per ton basis up and down the supply chain. Like I said earlier, from forest managers and farmers and through the biotech sector and into the product spaces that are produced, and these are domestic. And so there's, a broader, domestic incentive to adopt, sustainable technologies and to have a green economy. That's been shown. And the bioeconomy has there's a broad array of chemicals, that could be produced from agricultural feedstocks which, as I will, talk about, have the potential to sequester far more carbon than they emit. Combined with a decarbonized electricity grid and electrified transportation, you could imagine the emergence of supply chains that are carbon neutral or even carbon negative without the need for offsets. Those supply chains are already being pursued by corporations looking to decrease their reliance on petroleum. And in the current iteration of the bioeconomy, products are associated with with the bioeconomy, right? Like you think about feedstocks being used to produce fuels or chemicals or plastics or textiles or materials, right? And, as we begin to, further reduce the, carbon intensity of these individual products, perhaps down to zero or even negative, you can think about the bioeconomy then even servicing the negative emissions markets with decoupled credits, either associated with linear pathways or as standalone carbon farming pathways as well. So there's really a lot of opportunity in this space. Now, I want to be realistic about highlighting what is the current state of the bioeconomy. Essentially now, the bioeconomy is basically just a corn ethanol bioeconomy. We produce this slide says 15 billion gallons, but it's actually closer to 16 billion gallons of corn ethanol per year. And it's significant because the value of a biofuel is tied directly to its carbon intensity. So unlike all those other products that I mentioned that you could produce from biomass, fuels already have a carbon market, and they are, like I said, the value of the biofuel is tied to its carbon intensity. They're the only product that could scale in the original iteration vision of the bioeconomy without completely blowing up those markets, because the fuel markets are so big, and so that's where most of the investments went. Now, the importance of the carbon intensity and being associated with the value of a biofuel is because, like I said, there's markets that exist for biofuels. This plot shows the price of the low carbon fuel credits under California's low carbon fuel standard policy over the past few years. Average credit prices have been over $200 a ton for the past 3 years, and actually over the past couple of years, it's been up near $200 a ton. And when we look at the life cycle emissions of a biofuel, it's actually the added emissions from each stage of its production, from farming and agriculture to transporting the materials to refining it into ethanol, the separations that are associated with that, denaturization of the ethanol, and then the tailpipe emissions at combustion. And the additive sum of that is about 70 grams of CO2 per megajoule of ethanol, and you get paid on the difference between your biofuel price and that of a petroleum baseline. So if you can reduce the emissions associated with your biofuel, you can increase that difference, and you get paid more for it, $200 per ton. Now, the real tricky thing is that we only have good tools for measuring on a batch basis the emissions downstream of feedstock production. Upstream of feedstock production, i.e. all feedstock production and farming, we use national averages. And 40% of the life cycle emissions are in this bin where, are in the 40% of emissions where we can't assess the carbon intensity on a field scale. And so even though the price of carbon is $200 a ton, and you would say, oh, that could create a very large incentive for farmers, it can't extend all the way up to farmers. And so there are essentially, even with this high carbon price, no incentives for farmers to adopt new technologies or more sustainable practices. And that's something that we need to change. Now, that's where ARPA-E comes in, and we are really thinking about the prospects for the bioeconomy becoming a major tool for offering us necessary, products for our carbon-based economy, while also servicing this very big negative emissions industry. And so what we've developed a number of programs situated along this bioeconomy supply chain to achieve this vision. And what I'm going to talk about today in the next, session is the Smart Farm program, which is our investment in all of the technologies to develop those tools to measure that carbon harvest, so that as we develop more carbon markets beyond the biofuel ones, we can connect farm practices to carbon markets. So with that, that is the first, part of the session. And I think we might be a little bit ahead of time, but we can